So hey, welcome back to the course. So in this lecture, what we're going to do is we are going to do one more experiment on our microcontroller board. And the experiment is copying data from flash to SRAM. So what we're going to do is we are going to store some data onto the flash. Then we write a program where we copy that flash contents into SRAM. Great, so let's do that. So I'm ready with my project and I have here main.c. So now let me just type in main function. So let's say return 0. So now does it compile? Yes, it compiles. Great. Now we have to put some data into the flash memory. So how do you put a data into the flash memory? So the easiest way is we will define some constant data. So remember that the constant data will always store under the flash memory of the microcontroller because constant data are read-only in nature. So all the read-only data of your microcontroller program will be stored in flash memory. So now let's define read-only data. Let's say I write something like this: char my data. So it's a character array, and I'll just write I love embedded programming. So I just write this. So is it a legal way of storing this string into this array? It's correct, right? So it's a legal way of defining and initializing the character array, isn't it? Okay, so if I just compile it, then the compiler is happy. Now the question is, it is a global variable, isn't it? Because this is in a global scope of the program. So the global variables will always be stored in the RAM memory of your microcontroller. So now we can prove that. So what I do is now, so I'll just come here in the main program and I'll just use this variable. Now let me just define a variable called data, char data, and I'll just do char data is equal to my data of, let's say, 0. So what exactly happens here? My data of 0, that is the first character I, will be stored in data. It's very simple, right? So now let's just compile this code. So when I compile this, okay, there is one error. I mean, there's one problem. Variable data is never used. That's fine. So now what I do is I'll just compile. Now just download this code into your board and I'll just go to debugging mode and I'll just open my watch window and I'll just drag and drop this variable here. And here you can see that the address of this variable is this one. So can you identify this? This is nothing but the base address of the RAM, isn't it? So that proves that this data is stored in the RAM memory. Okay, remember your RAM memory starts from here in my microcontroller and this data is stored here, isn't it? Also, I'll just open the memory window and here you can see I'm observing the contents of RAM, base address of the RAM, and I can see all this data. So I can just put this here. And now what I do is I'll just select this and I'll right click and select as key, and here it is. This data is actually stored in the RAM memory starting from this address. So now I want to push this data into the flash memory, not to the RAM, because what I want to do is I want to put this data into the flash memory and then I want to read it to the RAM memory. So how do you move this data into the flash memory? So the easiest way is define this variable, this character array, with a qualifier const. So this is a const is a C qualifier to indicate a constant data. So in this case, now what happened is my data is no longer will be stored in the RAM memory, but it will be moved to the flash memory. Why? Because my data, which is actually a character array, is now mentioned with const qualifier. So now that means it is a constant data now. And as I said, const data will always be stored in the flash memory, because the constant data will be considered as read-only data, and the read-only data will always be stored in the flash memory of the microcontroller. So now let's through this. So now let me go out of the debugging mode and we'll just compile this code. Okay, so now it compiles successfully. So now let's just download this code and now again go to debugging mode, and you can see that that data is no longer present in the RAM. So previously it was here. So now what exactly the address of this data in the flash memory? So for that we'll go to our watch window, and here it is. Now it is saying that the address of this constant data is this one. Just copy that and analyze that address. So it starts from 08. So that means your flash starts from this address, right? This is a base address. So that means now this data is available at this location. Now let's copy this and go to your Keil IDE memory window and just paste and hit enter, and here it is. So now it is moved to the flash section. Great. So now we'll write a program to copy this data into the RAM memory. This is a const data or read-only data stored in the flash memory of the MCU. So now let me make another array. So I'll just give a name as destination data. All right, great. So now let's go out of the debugging mode, and now let's write a small program which copies this data into RAM. So let's first define the base address of the RAM. So base address of SRAM or RAM is, you know that, right? This is the base address. So just copy that. So our job is to copy from here to here, isn't it? So let's do that. We need a for loop, right? For int I is equal to 0. Okay, so I is just an index, and I is less than size of, right? Size of what? Size of my data, and I plus plus, and we have to copy from here, right, to here, right? So but we have to copy byte by byte, isn't it? So that's why, so this is our address where we have to copy, but we have to typecast that into uint 8 underscore t address, right? Because otherwise, if you don't do this, what happens is it will be treated as a pointer to int. So we don't want to do that, because we have to copy byte by byte. So now is equal to, so what do? My data of I, right? Correct. So here you have to do plus I, right? And then you have to store under this address, correct? Great. So now, so it is very simple, right? I hope you are understanding. So here what I'm doing, I'm just taking the base address of the RAM and typecasting it as a unsigned char pointer, because we have to increment this pointer actually byte by byte, not word by word. And I'm just dereferencing and putting the contents of my data into this address, correct? And let's compile this. So there are some 3 errors. uint 8 is undefined. So that's because if you want to use these type definitions, then you have to use, as I said in the previous videos, you have to use hash include stdint.h. Great. So now let's just compile, and let me put a breakpoint to observe loop by loop. Great. Now let's download and let's go into debugging mode, and and so here you can see this is pushed to this position. Why? Let's go and check. So now it is changed to 352. Just type 352 and yes, our data is here, right? Great. So now we have to observe now this one, right? So we have to see whether the data is getting copied here or not, right? So I'll just copy and paste here. Okay, so now what I do is I just keep a breakpoint here and I just hit enter. So now what I do is I'll just remove this and I'll just do step in, so one by one. And here you can see I is up here, and here you can see that the data is getting copied from flash to SRAM. So what's the takeaway from this lecture? Actually, the takeaway is not how we copy data from flash to SRAM, but to see where exactly the const data actually stored in the microcontroller. We proved that it actually stored in the flash memory of the microcontroller, whereas the global data, like if you remove this const variable here, then this data will be stored in the RAM memory of the microcontroller. Great. So if you have Eclipse, you can try the same code and you must get the same result, and let me know if you face any issues. Great. So I'll see you in the next lecture.